Okay, we're now going to take a look at one of the more difficult times in our country's history, and that's the Vietnam War. Vietnam is in Southeast Asia, and before Vietnam became a country, it was a part of the French colonial empire known as Indochina. The French had taken over that portion, which is going to be Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in the late 1800s, 1887, in a war they had with China. And it was a part of their colonial empire that they used to extract rice and rubber, which were very profitable, and they would sell that. And like many colonial imperialistic countries, oftentimes the mother country, in this case France, would treat the indigenous population, the Vietnamese, very, very poorly. And that's what they did. So consequently, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out that a lot of the Vietnamese wanted the French to get out, and they wanted to establish their own country. And America, after World War II, and the Iron Curtain, with the Soviet Union putting in place the worldwide communist revolution, we'll actually get involved in Indochina before we'll get involved in Korea. Korea was 1951 to 1954, and we'll get involved in Vietnam or Indochina in 1950. So let's get into it and start looking at it. America, as mentioned, will support France and its efforts to control and keep communism at bay and not to spread. Remember, China had fallen to the communists in 1949. So there's going to be a lot of names in here you're going to have to remember. And one of the early ones is the gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Army and revolutionaries. He will be based out of China, and he will be trying to get France out. Ho Chi Minh had been in Indochina from the 1930s, and he's trying to have a free Vietnam, communist Vietnam. And in 1940, the Japanese will attack and then put kind of a hold on that whole concept until World War II is over. And the Japanese will attack there in Vietnam against China. And we talked about it in our World War II unit about the atrocities and how harsh the Japanese were on China and the Vietnamese and Laos and Cambodia. But after the war gets done, Ho Chi Minh, who's still around, and what will be called the Viet Minh Organization, that's definitely one you want to start, the Viet Minh Organization, suddenly saw their chances of having an independent Vietnam become much more realistic as France was greatly depleted after World War II. He will actually declare Vietnam, the northern part of Vietnam, as independent. France controls the southern part, the southern half of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh is fighting from the north, along with the Viet Minh. As mentioned, oops, we're struggling here a little bit. The United States will get involved in Vietnam by sending $15 million to South Vietnam in 1950. And over the next 4 years, we'll spend almost $1 billion in aid. So we're going to spend a ton of money in Vietnam. And the reason we do this was during the Eisenhower administration, which is going to follow the Truman administration. Harry Truman is president until 1948, and then he'll get kicked out excuse me, until 1952, and then he'll have served his second term, and then he'll leave the office. He won't get kicked out. But China will fall to the communists in 1949, and that's the big, huge, gigantic wake-up call. And President Eisenhower's Secretary of State came up with the domino theory, and the domino theory said that if you didn't stop communism every time you went up against it, it would eventually, what it would do is it would take one country in a region, and then that country would spill over to the next one, and then it would spill over to the next one. Remember, communism, as I was saying in World War II, after World War II, and the Cold War, was a worldwide revolution, much like the radical Islamic terrorists were looking to have in the caliphate. It's not going to be contained to one country. It's not going to last in Syria. It wasn't going to last in just the Soviet Union. It was designed to be a worldwide revolution. And so in 1954, the Eisenhower administration, after 4 years of us giving aid to them, he's going to up that ante and give even more money to the French. The French, though, the French people are becoming more and more disenchanted with what's going on in Indochina. And finally, in 1954, the Viet Minh being the North Vietnamese communist-backed army of Ho Chi Minh, will overrun the French at an outpost called Dien Bien Phu. So we gotta put that one down. Dien Bien Phu is a small little area in the northwest part of Vietnam, and the communist-backed Viet Minh will kill about 3,000 French troops, and they'll behead a whole bunch of them, and it'll scare the living bejesuses out of France and the French people, and they'll say, "We're out," and they're going to leave. They're just going to leave, which is going to leave a huge vacuum in South Vietnam. So guess who's going to have to step in there? In 1954, we have the Geneva Accords, where we're going to have Vietnam, Vietnam be divided along the 17th parallel, and that means northern part is going to be communist, the southern part is going to be democracy or free. And in the Geneva Accords, France, Great Britain, the United States, Soviet Union, China, Laos, and Cambodia will all meet, and they'll say, okay, we're going to have this, and in 2 years, we're going to have free elections. And whoever the people elect, they will control all of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh controls North Vietnam. The anti-communist nationalists control South Vietnam. This is 1954, after the French had left Vietnam in the defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The 1956, though, elections were canceled. They weren't canceled by the communists. They were canceled by the South Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese were afraid underneath the president of the South, a gentleman by the name of Ngo Dinh. Mr. Ngo Dinh was afraid he was going to lose. Now, the reason he was afraid he was going to lose is because he was a corrupt leader. He doesn't treat the farmers, the peasants, very well at all. He's corrupt. He mistreats them. Dinh is a devout Catholic, like many of the French were. The problem with that is over 70% of the population in Vietnam, Indochina, was Hindu, and so you're trying to bring Christianity, Catholicism, to an area that is devout Hindu, and it never mixes, and this is going to be a problem that the United States will continually run into in the 20th century, later part of the 20th century, whether it be the Shah in Iran, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Mubarak in Egypt. If you want to go, Omar Gaddafi in Libya. You can kind of work your way around. You can go into South America, and we've had incidences where we're backing people that are good to the United States, but they're not good to their own people. So in 1956, when the elections were to be held for who's going to control all of Vietnam, it was called off by the South Vietnamese president. The Viet Minh will then start up war efforts and continue the war efforts against the South Vietnamese. Now, here's our next vocabulary term. You've got the Viet Minh, that's the North Vietnamese Communist Army. Now you've got the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong, what's the difference? Is the Viet Cong are in the South. The South is the Democratic side, but they have a faction of communists within the Democratic side because of President Dim's poor treatment of its own people. The communist opposition, the Viet Cong, will start killing political leaders. They will cause chaos, and the United States will go to great lengths to try to get the country under control by spending a ton of money, and it won't work. How does the Viet Cong get supplied? Well, there's a trail that was famously known as Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it's a path that the Viet Cong would receive their supplies. And again, Southeast Asia is a dense, very dense jungle. It's not like Nebraska. It's incredibly dense foliage. It's easy to hide, especially at this time when we didn't have technology, heat-seeking but ability to track someone's heat waves off of a person. You couldn't do that back then. So you just walk in the jungle and you couldn't see it because there was so much overgrowth. And they would follow the borders of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and supply the troops within South Vietnam. Kennedy's administration will increase its aid to the South Vietnamese and President Diem. We will send thousands of advisors as early as 1955 to train the South Vietnamese troops. In fact, by 1963, we had 16,000 military personnel in South Vietnam, 16,000 in 1963. Dim's popularity will continue to plummet. They will take land away from the peasants. Again, as mentioned, he will attack the Buddhist monks. He will imprison them, and he'll kill them. There's famously the monks and the nuns would go into South Vietnam, and they would sit down in the street, and they would pour gasoline on themselves, and they would light themselves on fire as a demonstration against Diem, and that would be shown on news, and he was extremely disliked. Finally, Diem will be assassinated when JFK in 1963 will say, we're just not going to protect him anymore. And because Diem had a lack of compassion for its own people in that and the other religions, they just knew that Diem was not the guy to unite all of Vietnam. And so the CIA will take out Mr. Diem, and there's no more Mr. Diem. Oops. And we're going to stop there right now, and then we'll get into section 2, which is the U.S. involvement escalating in 1965. Remember, President Kennedy is assassinated in October of 1963. So from 1963 to 1964, August 2nd of 1964, less than a year, what is that, 10 months, 9 months, we will get involved in Vietnam, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit.